Welcome, everybody. I'm Paul Root-Walpe, the Director of the Center for Ethics at Emory. And I want to welcome you all and thank you for attending today's seminar in honor of and in memorialization of Holocaust Memorial Day, which is going to be on Friday. This seminar is being sponsored by our center, the Center for Ethics, with the Center for the Study of Law and Religion and the Emory University School of Medicine. This is an annual seminar where we try to talk about what the connection is between what happened in Germany and Europe in the middle of the 20th century and medicine. Medicine played a large, important, and tragic role in the Holocaust. So I am delighted that you're here. We have a fascinating program for you tonight. And to introduce that program, I'm going to turn it over now to Ira Bedzo, the Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion.
Thanks, Paul. First off, I'm only a senior scholar there, but I
I
appreciate the promotion. And also, I never want to say that I'm excited for these types of programs, but they're definitely educational, and hearing Amanda speak is not only is she a scholar in this field, but she gives a way of speaking about the Holocaust that not only makes it historically accurate, but relevant to the contemporary world. So let me give a quick bio to who Amanda is so that you can appreciate her as much as I do, and then we'll let Amanda go into it. So Dr. Amanda Caleb is professor of medical humanities at Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine. As part of her interest in bioethics and Holocaust studies, she examines the process of medicalization of social policies implemented during the Nazi regime. Dr. Caleb is part of an inaugural cohort of fellows for the Project on Bioethics and the Holocaust, using testimony in medical and health professions education, which is a partnership between the USC Shoah Foundation and the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust. The goal of that fellowship is to produce readily accessible resources on medicine, ethics, and the Holocaust that will empower students and in-service professionals internationally to prioritize ethical principles and human dignity in the medical and health professions. So not to tell you or to tell Amanda what she's speaking about, but I will give a quick intro into the topic for tonight. This topic will focus on the ways in which Nazi social policies were grounded in their racial hygiene agenda, which meant medicalizing individuals who participated in so-called deviant behavior, who contributed or failed to contribute to the nation's welfare, and who are considered a threat to the citizenry and the health of the nation. As an expert in this area, Dr. Caleb will speak about the public health frame of Nazi racial hygiene and include survivor testimony in her talk to show both the high-level policy frame as well as how such policies affected individuals. So for that, I'm going to let Amanda take the virtual floor, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Great. Thank you so much, Ira, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. I do have some audio clips, as Ira mentioned, survivor testimony. If there's any audio issues, if someone can just let me know, I would greatly appreciate it. So the talk is Rassenhygiene as Public Health, the Medicalization of Social Policies in Nazi Germany. And I have no financial relationship with a commercial entity relevant to material in this talk. I just wanted to echo what Ira mentioned about the collaborative effort. This presentation is based on my chapter in the book Bioethics and the Holocaust, a contemporary study in how the Holocaust continues to shape the ethics of health, medicine, and human rights, which is edited by Stacey Gallen and Ira Bedzo. And this is part of a partnership, as Ira mentioned, between the USC Shoah Foundation, the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust to create this project on bioethics and the Holocaust. And I've included the website for this project that includes access to the book. And I've also put a QPR code, on the screen for those of you who prefer to use that to access it. I do want to thank both organizations, the USC Shoah Foundation and MEMA, for their support of mine and others' work, and especially the Shoah Foundation, as I'll be using testimonies from their visual archived as part of this talk. I want to begin with a quote from Goebbels about the Nazi eugenics program. Our starting point is not the individual, and we do not subscribe to the view that one should feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, or clothe the naked. Our objectives are entirely different. We must have a healthy people in order to prevail in the world. In the spirit of Thomas Malthus, Goebbels argues against the Christian doctrine of mercy, juxtaposing it as being in conflict with health, specifically the health of the nation. To help others when they are in need, one might conclude, would be unhealthy, according to the statement. The individual then cannot be the starting point because the individual threatens health and ultimately the ability to not just survive, but become a world power. Here, Goebbels encapsulates the essence of my talk, the development of a public health policy of Rassenhygiene, race hygiene, which is an outgrowth of eugenics, that was built upon the medicalization of bodies and social policies. It is through this medicalization that the Nazis were able to realize the murder of millions of people deemed unworthy of mercy and therefore unworthy of life. Underpinning Nazi social policies and the Holocaust was this concept of Rassenhygiene, a term first coined by Alfred Ploetz in 1895 and adopted by the Nazi Party in the 1920s. On the one hand, Rassenhygiene was eugenics, the scientifically erroneous belief society should cultivate the reproduction of so-called desirable hereditary traits and limit the reproduction of so-called undesirable hereditary traits, concepts which were socially constructed, yet guised in the language of science and the application of statistics. If eugenics took its starting point as the individual by focusing on lineage and tracing desirable traits, then Rassenhygiene turned to the population, conceptualizing race as both something singular, an ethnic group displaying similar physical and mental traits, or really any group defined as a race, and universal, humanity, and incorporating the disease-preventing science of hygiene. Rassenhygiene, then, was a means of protecting a race. For the Nazis, the Aryan race, by preventing diseases from infiltrating and harming that very race. Within its eugenics framework, Rassenhygiene imagined such hereditary traits as the very diseases that threatened the race. Thus, for Rassenhygiene to take hold as a concept and as a public health policy, it required the medicalization of bodies and social policies. Medicalization occurs when, quote, a problem is defined in medical terms, described using medical language, understood through the adoption of a medical framework, or treated with a medical intervention. And it describes the process by which non-medical problems become defined and treated as medical problems, usually in terms of illness or disorders. The emphasis on process is reflective of both the machinations and breadth of medicalization, which extend beyond the hospital into social and political arenas. Most studies of medicalization trace its emergence to 17th century Enlightenment thinking, grounded in scientific and medical attempts to control nature. The rise in medical authority in the 19th century resulted in more widespread medicalization, including that of the life processes, birth, adolescence, and death, and the increased use of hospitalization. The emergence of eugenics in the 19th century signaled a shift to a politicized medicalization that was embedded in social policies and legal doctrines designed to separate and cure individuals deemed mentally unfit and therefore socially undesirable. As summarized by Frank Decatur, quote, eugenics was not so much a clear set of scientific principles as our modern way of talking about social problems in biologizing terms. I want to underscore this point. The initial power of eugenics and of Rassenhygiene is in the very language used to describe these concepts and the people impacted by them. Medicalization is effective and becomes pervasive because the very language of medicine, those biological terms, hold power in its labels of health healthy and unhealthy. As noted by Conrad and Schneider, quote, the greatest social control power comes from having the authority to define certain behaviors, persons, and things. This power is built upon what Michel Foucault termed biopolitics, which I'm going to oversimplify incredibly in the interest of time, and describe it as a political rationality focused on controlling bodies in support of the nation state. Foucault sees this political approach emerging in conjunction with the advent of scientific advancements, allowing for such control of bios, and situated within a political shift focused on the safety and sanctity of the population. Within a literal and metaphorical war, this is, as Foucault describes it, quote, a battle that has to be waged not between races, but by a race that is portrayed as the one true race, the race that holds power and is entitled to define the norm, and against those who deviate from that norm, against those who pose a threat to the biological heritage. Biopolitics is built upon biopower, what Foucault describes as, quote, such a power, the power to foster life or disallow it to the point of death, and such a power has to qualify, measure, appraise, and hierarchize through normalization based on the state's determined preference and subsequently creating othering or otherness, a threat to the bios and to the nation. Biopower and this difference of same and other or normal and abnormal is internalized through subjectification. We can see this process in a number of health spaces, including in our contemporary society, breastfeeding and obesity. Before I move into some of the social policies that form the backbone of Rassenhygiene, I want to first share a clip from the Shoah Foundation's visual archive that contextualize how this concept of Rassenhygiene was internalized, or at least understood at that time. Ursula Matthews was a member of the Nazi youth, and in this clip, she discusses how she understood race hygiene as a child.
Heine had a disability, and in Germany, obviously, those who had disabilities were at a serious disadvantage. Did that ever?
Oh yes, I remember how strict they were. You know, about if you weren't perfect, you were kind of not the same. You know, you were looked at like not feeling sorry for you, but kind of like you're a nuisance. You know. And yet I knew a little verse that says, never torture an animal for the fun of it, because it hurts them, the animals, as much as it hurts you when you torture them, you know. So I was always following that, but nobody told me about people, you know. They said that some people are better than others. That's what I learned, you know. And the people that are not as good, they shouldn't be here, you know. We want a strong race. We want, you know, people that are healthy.
Do you remember that verse in German?
Remember, yeah. But I already started then thinking that how kind of messed up that was, you know, because I knew that wasn't right. I knew that wasn't right. I mean, you cannot put an animal over a human, you know.
Can you recite that verse in German?
Ja, I know. I always said, quäle nie ein Tier zum Scherz, denn es fühlt wie du den Schmerz. That's about an animal torturing because it feels this pain the same way than you do. That I always remembered. I would never kill even a fly or anything, you know. That's one thing I learned. But when it came to people, there was nobody there to teach it, you know. Some people were worse more than others, you know.
Her description of disability and the Nazi race exemplifies how medicalization was an effective means of implementing Rassenhygiene, perpetuating the idea of improving the race by claiming others were medically inferior and therefore could only be cured or killed for the sake of the nation. And I think it's interesting to point out that Ms. Matthews mentioned that there was no one there to teach, and yet, as you can see on the screen right now with the closed caption, she ends with saying some people were worth more than others, you know. So somewhere something was taught. And my argument, this is part of the pervasiveness of medicalization at this time.
Heine
Apologies for the technical issue of trying to advance this slide.
had a disability.
In mobilizing their followers, Nazi leaders evoked the concept of Volkskörper, frequently translated as national body, and often understood as metaphorical, akin to the body politic. However, Volkskörper was more than a metaphor, just as Fremdkörper, or foreign body, was more than a metaphor for Jews. This language was the product of medicalization that colonized language itself, so that Jews were not just Fremdkörper to the country, they were seen as a literal infection, a threat to the healthy nation. Both Hitler and Himmler described Jews as diseases or disease agents, using phrases like Rassentuberkulose, race tuberculosis, and bacillus, respectively, evoking the need for a medical and public health response to protect German bodies under the umbrella of Rassenhygiene. Jews, along with homosexuals, and I'm using that phrase because of the medicalized connotation, political objectors, and criminals were all categorized as Volksschadling, parasite or vermin of the people, a threat that was both internal and external to the Volkskörper. Jews and people with so-called hereditary disabilities were described as parasites, categorized as threats because of their perceived biological inferiority. Collectively, those deemed unfit were described as Gemeinschaftsfremde, alien to the community, emphasizing both their otherness and their threat to the healthy body politic as alien bodies. The ability to create such division rested on the medicalization of bodies, realized biopower that was actualized in social policies, which perpetuated so-called biological difference. Importantly, physicians and scientists were central to both the alleged evidence for and implementation of racial hygiene policies, making such medicalization manifest. The Nazis medicalized politics as much as they politicized medicine. Problems of racial, sexual, or social deviance were transformed into surgical problems in need of surgical solutions. These surgical solutions were both literal, in terms of sterilization and medicalized murder, and social, through the development of policies that cut off those deemed eugenically unfit. Social policies were informed and strengthened by appeals to medical authority and medicalization of social and physical bodies. Such policies included those created to address so-called deviant behavior, to limit or expand access to government assistance, and to deny citizenship rights to individuals. And here I'll turn to some of those policies to illustrate this medicalization. The very creation of the label deviant is an act of social control, signaling an unwillingness or inability to conform to the expectations and requirements of one's society. Such categorization reveals the relationality of deviance, understood only through the moral and social norms defined by those in power at a given time. This label serves as a dividing process, indicating difference that is unacceptable to society, and therefore an implied danger to the social order. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the rise of medicalization allowed for such social categorization to be scientifically classified. Thus, behaviors once deemed deviant because they did not adhere to social expectations were seen as medical conditions, such as homosexuality. Moreover, the rise of eugenics and criminal anthropology mapped deviance onto the body, suggesting that criminal behavior was hereditary and identifiable based on one's physiology and physiognomy. These shifts to the medico-scientific approaches paradoxically increased and limited the scope of defining deviance. Their authority allowed for politicians and physicians to expand definitions of deviance, while the so-called biological evidence restricted claims of deviance to those which were based on medico-scientific knowledge. Thus, in order to expand their racial hygiene agenda, Nazis medicalized social policies themselves, which resulted in greater control of those deemed to be engaging in deviant behavior. Despite the new German Imperial Criminal Code of 1871 and the classification of homosexuality as, quote, mental illness by Krafft-Ebing, the criminal persecution of homosexuals was not widespread in Germany or even enforced in Prussia in the early 20th century. Yet the appointment of Hitler to the chancellorship ended any disregard for the criminal code. His attack on homosexuality is seen as both an attempt to purify the Volkskörper and to later justify the murder of Ernst Röhm in 1934, who was openly gay and a potential rival in the Nazi regime. While the latter speaks to Hitler's political machinations, the former supports the broad medicalization that shaped Nazi thinking. In March 1933, Hitler announced the Campaign for a Clear Reich, which forced all gay and lesbian bars to shut, destroyed Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science, and abolished all gay presses. The campaign indicated both a moral and medical cleansing of the Volkskörper, reflective of a pathologizing of homosexuality that was supported in the mid-1930s by German doctors who claimed homosexuality threatened public health, even describing it as an epidemic. This medicalization of homosexuality was amplified by Himmler's 1936 creation of the Reich Central Office for the Combating of Homosexuality and Abortion. The association of homosexuality with abortion speaks to the Nazis' concern with reproduction, declining birth rates, and the nation's body. The marital medical metaphor of combating the martial medical metaphor of combating so-called social deviance positions reproduction and the national good against non-reproduction and individual threats. Combating suggests both fighting and curing. And the Reich Central Office for Combating of Homosexuality and Abortion focused efforts on policing homosexuality, manifested Nazi beliefs of homosexuality as a disease. Such efforts were divided into curing the disease of homosexuality and stopping its spread, the latter of which included the elimination of any individuals with hereditary-based homosexuality, labeled as incorrigibles, by sending them to concentration camps. The prosecution of the gay community was a social policy designed to support the Nazi racial hygiene program by isolating the disease of homosexuality so as not to infect others and the national body. Another group that the Nazis viewed as an infection risk to the Volkskörper was the broad category of asocials, individuals who engaged in behavior that was antithetical to the nation's goals and health. And this included the work-shy, criminals, vagrants, beggars, prostitutes, unmarried mothers, alcoholics, and anyone else who was, quote, unwilling to adapt to the life of the community. According to Wolfgang Knorr, a physician working in the racial political office, asocials were conspicuous, not by occasional crime, but by their general inability to be useful in the life of the national community. As non-contributing members of the nation, they were an economic burden. As hereditary carriers of asocial behavior, they were a racial threat. In a rehabilitative attempt, an asocial colony was created in Bremen in 1936. Haschüde, as it was called, was a virtual prison, with families being forced to live in houses that were guarded and inspected for cleanliness by Nazi officials. Children in Haschüde were required to join the Hitler Youth and were taught about hygiene. This colony created both the separation of those seen as disease from healthy citizens and the imperative to be cleaner and therefore healthier in order to return to society. In other words, these individuals needed to be cured through commitment to the Volkskörper. The closing of Haschüde in 1940 coincided with a push beginning in 1938 to decrease spending on asocials, who many in the Nazi Party deemed as uncurable because of a hereditary stain. This argument justified the sterilization of some asocials under the law for the prevention of hereditary disease offspring and their deportation to work in concentration camps. Nazi leaders believed the health of the Volkskörper was dependent upon individuals' physical, mental, and social health and racial purity, which included commitment to the ideals of the Nazi Party. Those who could not or would not conform were marginalized, stripped of their rights, and eventually killed. The Nazis redefined citizenship in particular by changing it from that of the state to that of the Reich, what is called Reichsbürger, and defining membership to the Volkskörper based on blood and heredity, making such citizens literal parts of the Volkskörper. This medicalization of citizenship was a hallmark of Nazi politics, evident as early as 1920 in their 25 points program, and this quote is from that program. None but members of the nation may be citizens of the state. None but those of German blood, whatever their creed, may be members of the nation. No Jew, therefore, may be a member of the nation. This declaration's language identifies Jews as ethnically and racially different from Germans, particularly given the use of the word Volk in the original German, setting the stage for rhetoric to become reality. These racial claims were realized in the enactment of the Reich Citizenship Law on September 15th, 1935, the first of the Nuremberg Laws. Article 2, Concept of Reich Citizenship, states, and this is a quote on the slide, a citizen of the Reich is only that subject who is of German or kindred blood, and who, through his conduct, proves that he's both willing and able to faithfully serve the German people and the Reich. Underpinning this law was a commitment to racial hygiene, an opportunity to purge the citizenry of individuals deemed racially inferior to Germans and who were seen as infecting the Volkskörper. In other words, medicalized racial discrimination. The primary targets of this law were Jews and later Roma, Sinti, and Black people. And historians have thoroughly traced their persecution from the Nuremberg Laws to the concentration camps. In their commentary on the Nuremberg Laws, Nazi Party lawyers Wilhelm Stuckart and Hans Glob argued, every people is damaged in its vital capacities by absorption of alien blood into the Volkskörper. But one of its practical concerns should be to keep its blood pure. Their implication of Jewish blood as poisoning the Volkskörper was used as a justification for purging the Jews from the Reich, first linguistically, then legally, and finally lethally. In the act of legally denaturalizing Jews, the Nazi government also asserted that Jews' natural state was one of inferiority to German biological superiority. Stuckart and Glob rationalized that, quote, Jews who constitute an alien body among all European peoples are especially characterized by racial foreignness. Jews, therefore, cannot be seen as being fit for service to the German Volk and Reich. The stress on racial difference, on being unfit, and on being alien to the German social body all speak to the medicalization of Jews as a problem to be solved by medico-scientific legislation. Moreover, the subsequent classification system that determined how Jewish an individual was, and thus if they were given the rights of citizenship, represents eugenics-based scientific classification designed to further divide individuals through supposed medical authority and biopower. And on this slide is a Nuremberg race laws teaching chart that many of you have probably seen before, but divides out the different categories of how, quote unquote, Jewish someone is and in relation to citizenship. Such medico-legal language and action reduced Jews to an imposed biological status and denied rights to political action, movement, and eventually life. In the following testimony, survivor Gary Schuf discusses the impact of the Reich citizenship law on him as a young child.
Thinking back now on your either school years or the early 30s, when do you recall becoming aware of Hitler or anti-Semitism?
The time when schools started excluding me from classes and from activities. They pointed me out as being different. You cannot salute a flag, you're a Jew. You cannot sing the national anthem, you're a Jew. You cannot take a class that teaches Nazism and a political type of subject. I had to leave the classroom and wait outside until the class was over. I knew I was different. I knew I was Jewish. There was no doubt about it.
Mr. Schuf was denied the ability to participate in activities signaling citizenship because of policies that medicalized difference as a threat to the national body. And note, he emphasized the phrase, I knew I was different. This is part of that medicalization in terms of citizenship. While the Reich citizenship law guaranteed citizenship to individuals with German blood, it only did so if individuals were loyal and served the state. This additional requirement reflects the Nazi racial hygiene program that sought not only to cleanse the Volkskörper of racially inferior individuals, but also to cleanse itself of individuals that, while sharing its German blood, threatened the Volkskörper through their degenerative and unproductive behavior. In Stuttgart and Globe's commentary, they explain that misfits, which included criminals and individuals who committed offenses against the state, could be excluded from Reich citizenship. While there is little evidence of Germans being stripped of their citizenship except those who fled Nazi Germany, such language, tied to a biological understanding of citizenry, functions as biopower to maintain social order and control. Individuals would want to avoid actions that could result in the forfeiture of their citizenship because that also meant the loss of their biological status within the Volk and as part of the Volkskörper.
Thinking back,
The central tenet of Nazi medicalization was the health of the national body, which included placing the needs of the community over any individual needs. Realized through the slogan, and I'm not going to butcher the German on this, but what's translated in English to the common need over individual need. As such, the introduction of economic incentives and the regulation of government assistance were used to help promote and grow a stronger, healthier nation. Through these policies, the government sought to support reproductive efforts of eugenically fit parents while limiting economic and social resources for individuals deemed to be genetically unfit or not contributing to the health of the nation. As such, reproduction was anything but personal. As noted by the Nazis' women group, marriage is not merely a private matter, but one which directly affects the fate of the nation at its very roots. Marriage and procreation were acts that were medicalized through racial hygiene, which invaded the private space of a marriage and the bedroom. The enactment of the law for the protection of German blood and German honor on September 15, 1935, the second of the Nuremberg Laws, medicalized nationality and religion in order to distinguish so-called pure Aryan blood from Jewish blood by forbidding marriage or sexual relations between Germans and Jews. 2 months later, this law was extended to other groups deemed unfit, including Roma, Sinti, and Black people. Physician Ernst Rudin evoked imagery of preventing sexually transmitted diseases and subsequent degeneration in his praise of the law for, quote, preventing the further penetration of the German gene pool by Jewish blood. This law was supplemented for the law for the protection of the hereditary health of the German people, enacted on October 18, 1935, which required individuals to seek public health certification of their eugenetic fitness to marry. As Robert Proctor has noted, quote, the Nuremberg Laws were generally considered public health measures. Germany's leading health officials saw the prevention of human genetic disease along with the prevention of racial miscegenation as part of a single program of responsible public health policy. Thus, the Nuremberg Laws position medicine and health as central to their goals, and their execution in the middle of the marital bed. Nazi propaganda not only encouraged adherence to the laws, but also aimed for the public to internalize how these laws would reflect them. Using the term Rassenhygiene, or race defilement, and Blutschande, blood defilement, Nazis emphasized that sexual relations were a threat to the health of the nation. Advertising a special issue of the magazine Stürmer, this poster reads, and this is the image on the right side of your screen, since 1923, Julius Streicher has enlightened the public about defiling the race. In 1935, the Führer declared defiling the race to be a criminal act, punishable by imprisonment. Nevertheless, thousands of race crimes continue to be committed in Germany by Jews. What is race pollution? Why did the Führer decree the Nuremberg Laws? Why does the Jew instigate the German woman to race defilement, systematically and on a mass scale? What are the consequences of defiling the race for the German woman and the German girl? What are the consequences of race defilement for the German nation? The new Stürmer special issue. Survivor Fred Sarn shares how the Nuremberg Laws and Rassenhygiene impacted Jews and contributed to their dehumanization.
Year by year, and with every new law, Jewish people felt the degradation and the humiliation due to this law. The first thing was in 1935.
What happened then?
The Nuremberg Law were degraded, were inaugurated, I would say. That means no Jew could go to a German doctor. We could not go in movies. We could not have Aryan people as maids or workers in our private homes. And we could no more have socialize with German people. It was even dangerous to have a German girl because many Jewish men would at this time put in incarceration. They called them Rassenschänder.
And what were they?
Rassenschänder. That means to, how can I translate it? The race is the German Caucasian race, and you make the race unrein, unclean.
Okay.
Yeah. The ethnic cleaning of the German race began. And who was guilty of doing this to dirty the German race was a Rassenschänder.
Mr. Sarn emphasizes the ways in which the laws perpetuated the rhetoric of disease and filth, a language that contributed to the medicalization of Jewish bodies.
Yeah,
In order to avoid Rassenhygiene, the Nazis venerated Aryan mothers, as these reproductive women were seen as the source of future growth and therefore national expansion. Thus, motherhood was quantified and medicalized as central to nurturing the Volkskörper, with financial incentives and government support tied to the ability to reproduce eugenically fit children. On June 1st, 1933, the government introduced a marriage loan scheme under the law to reduce unemployment, which granted each newly married couple a loan of 1,000 Reichsmarks with a low interest rate, provided the wife gave up her job. A quarter of the loan was forgiven for each child the couple bore. The financial incentive tied to procreation and female domesticity quantified the value of reproduction and motherhood for both individuals and the state. Mothers and children were afforded additional state welfare benefits through the establishment of the Mother and Child Relief Agency in February 28, 1934. This agency provided necessities, clothing, bed linen, and food for mothers and their children, education on breastfeeding, and the poster on the left shows one of these propaganda slogans about Aryan mothers and breastfeeding, and recuperation homes that allowed for mothers to recover from childbirth while being further educated in Nazi ideology. The program medicalized motherhood by creating an imperative for healthy mothers, defined as loyal to racial hygiene and the Volkskörper, to raise their children in ways that supported the state, both in terms of their health and their education. While the Nazi government provided benefits to eugenically fit Germans, it denied or restricted those same benefits to those who were deemed to be parasites, seen as taking from the nation without providing any benefit. In 1933, the Nazi government brought all welfare services under the auspices of the National Socialist People's Welfare, eliminating private welfare organizations and distributing benefits only to individuals deemed racially superior, which was determined by their value for the people's community, or the Volksgemeinschaft. Asocial Jews and other Volksschadling were excluded from a number of state-sponsored benefits, including the aforementioned marriage loan scheme, and saw reductions in their government assistance. Moreover, individuals with mental health illnesses and so-called hereditary disabilities were depicted in Nazi propaganda as being an economic burden and biological threat to the health of the nation, an argument used to justify the reduction in their benefits, their forced sterilization under the law for the prevention of hereditary diseased offspring, and their eventual murder. I've included one example of this propaganda. Some of you may have seen this before, but it shows the same amount of money is spent on one person who, on the left, has a so-called hereditary disease, as it can be spent on this family of 5 healthy Germans. These individuals were medicalized not only because of a believed biological inferiority, but also because they were deemed to contribute nothing to society. The label useless eater became a justification for the policy of medicalized killing. The strength of Rassenhygiene was in a medicalized rhetoric of protecting and cleansing the national body. And that turned the Volkskörper from metaphor to the impetus for mass murder. It would be easy, convenient to compartmentalize the Holocaust and Rassenhygiene in the past and perpetuated by immoral, evil individuals, isolated from our present that has learned from this past. Like many survivors, Ruth Lindemann warns not only the risk of thinking such an event is isolated, but in failing to recognize the role medicine, culture, and education played in creating the conditions and actively encouraging the killing of millions.
Lessons do you think we can take from the Holocaust?
That it can happen anywhere, anytime. And as I indicated to many people already, that why we study it in the first place is because it didn't happen in a vacuum, and it didn't happen in some remote part of Africa. This was instigated by a country that was the center of Western culture and Western technology. They had the world sent people over there to study. They were the most advanced country practically in the world at that time. I'm talking about Germany and Austria. People went there to study medicine and music, and people looked up to those countries. And then they used that technology to destroy half of Europe or more than that. And not only that, but all of Europe seemed to lose its moral compass in its wake. And it happens, it happens like that.
Lessons do you think we can take?
Yeah, we continue to see the harmful effects of medicalization based on difference, whether that is the medicalization of homosexuality, played out in the 21st century with blood donation bans that have only recently been relaxed or removed. The medicalization of crime, subjecting inmates to forcible or coerced sterilization in the United States. The medicalization of immigrants as harbingers of disease. And I'll just pause to read this quote from 2020 from David Ward, who was an ICE agent. We have these individuals coming from all over the world that have some of the most extreme medical care in the world. They are coming in with diseases such as smallpox and leprosy and TB that are going to infect our people in the United States. And the medicalization of lower socioeconomic status individuals and single parents as the cause of what Newt Gingrich called a sick society, or as David Cameron described, a broken Britain. And he also used the phrase sick society, I should say. At the end of the medicalization of society, Peter Conrad poses the following questions. How will medicalization affect the organization of society? And how will we deal with the consequences? I would respond to the first question by suggesting we have seen some of the effect on social organization, most clearly in how the Nazis used the medicalization of social control to advance Rassenhygiene, and in the brief examples I've provided of medicalization today. Herb Haynes has pointed out that medicalization depoliticizes moral problems by reconceptualizing them in medical and scientific terms that are considered to be above morality, i.e. in the realm of facts and scientific certainty. This depolitization, particularly at the policy level, contributes to the social stigma of individuals who are medicalized through these social policies, creating a dangerous situation in which the public does not question this process because of the perceived authority of medicine. Peter Conrad's second question poses two threads that need answering: a response to what we do with the knowledge of medicalization, and a response about the perceived inevitability of medicalization. To the former, we must dedicate ourselves to understanding that historical events are not static or isolated. They inform current practices and shape the biopower and biopolitics that control our lives today. To the latter, we should challenge the inevitability of medicalization, particularly with regard to social policies and the diagnosis of a sick society. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. There's a question in the Q&A column, if you can access that. Maybe you want to address it. I'll read it, okay?
Thank you.
Please comment on the similarity of the current situation whereby COVID vaccines are forced on the population, including penalties of job loss, refusal of medical care, controlling of bodies in the support of the nation state, to activity in Germany. Unvaccinated labeled as disease agents, deviant behaviors defined as refusing the vaccine, and the unvaccinated designated not fit for service to the nation, therefore can lose jobs, and isn't forced vaccination a manifestation of promoting common need over individual need?
Great, thanks for that question. So I think this is a complicated one, and I'm going to kind of tread a little bit lightly as I answer it, but I would certainly agree the labeling is spot on to the medicalization. The disease agent, the deviant behavior, all of that speaks exactly to the type of language used by the Nazis. What I would say as well is the policies of punitive action, so the loss of jobs, can also speak to that biopolitics as well. Similar to something, just to have another analogy, wellness programs that reward, say, weight loss or lowering blood pressure can be seen as another form of biopolitics. And there's been scholars who've written about that. I think where I want to tread lightly in the caution here is always thinking about that what is about the protection of the nation versus the medicalization that is actively harming others. And so I think vaccination becomes a really interesting point of conversation, because on the one hand, we have an argument that vaccination is obviously helpful to protect those who cannot perhaps be vaccinated or who are more vulnerable. We've heard that a lot with COVID-19. And so in that regard, that's actually protecting those that the Nazis would have deemed so-called unfit or not eugenically fit. On the flip side, that labeling and the punishing of those who are unvaccinated, I think really misses the mark of the point of vaccination, the assumption that they are somehow disease harbingers or any of the other disease agents, any of those phrases, does nothing to actually help the health of anyone. And so I think that's something we have to be very cautious about in terms of the use of language. I think public health is always treading this very fine line, to be honest, where thinking about the health of a population is ultimately, its main goal. At the same time, we have to kind of interrogate and be cautious about at what point does the health of the nation risk actively harming individuals. So I think the language for me is certainly problematic because it is that medicalization, but I proceed with caution when we're thinking about the importance of vaccination.
While we're waiting for another question to come into the Q&A, if you don't mind, I'll ask a question, and I'm not quite sure if it takes us too far afield or not, but it speaks a little bit not only to what you talked about in your talk, but also the question that we just had on vaccinations. How much was the medicalization in Nazi Germany used as a strategy or a tactic to justify like racist sentiment that was already in place? And how much, or was it more that medicalization became the way through which people saw social issues? And because medicalization became that frame, like the ultimate consequence was racist sentiment. Like how did that feed into each other? And then given that answer, like what does that mean in terms of how we see intent or directionality today?
Great, thanks for that, Ira. And if I missed something in your question, please.
Yeah, it was a long one. I apologize.
No, that's okay. But my answer is actually both. I think they actually are both at work here. And I say that because medicalization is at play, at least 2 centuries beforehand. We think about, where we tend to trace it back to the Enlightenment. And so I think that actually is something that's already there that can justify some of these racist sentiments. I think you're spot on that first half, but I think it also becomes a vehicle to perpetuate it. And I think that's actually where public health comes in and Rassenhygiene is it becomes this tool, right, that says, okay, now it's not just a justification, but we can actually harness this. And I think to me, that's the real power of the Nazi propaganda, is that it's the rhetoric. The language is what starts all of this, because first we have the language of how we refer to people, then we have policies that are going to use that very language, and then we have practices that are playing out in the policies. So I think they're actually feeding each other, and that in some ways is what makes it so powerful and so pervasive, is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, so to speak, in some ways. As one is saying, this is a justification, it's also using the other as the tool for that justification. So when we think about it today, I think it's something I think we have to pay a lot of attention to, and I am not, I want to be very careful in saying I'm not disparaging the medical profession when I say this. It's the misapplication of medicine or the over medicalization that's happening that is really the problem. And so this can become very easily justification for all sorts of policies that we're already saying we want. I'm just going to go to David Cameron for a moment. When he describes a broken Britain, he is referring specifically to the lower classes and single parent homes. And so he takes that social policy and the fact that he calls it a broken Britain and a sick society is really taking that language of medicine that if someone's sick, we seek to cure them. If something is broken, we seek to fix it. And it becomes a problem of, the individuals and really doesn't address the broader social issues, but it also allows for a perpetuation of discrimination. And so you actually had a lot of responses at the time where people are saying, yeah, single parents are the problem. Britain is not doing great because of single parents. And we saw the same thing in the US in the 1980s in the Reagan administration, the phrase welfare queen, that whole rhetoric that comes out, we're using the language of medicine in order to justify racially held beliefs or discriminatory beliefs. And then that becomes the fodder to just make those beliefs seem more legitimate and real because they have the backings of medical authority.
No, Amanda, thank you. That was a great answer that allowed me to see not only the both and, but why the both and reinforce each other into a vicious cycle if it gets out of control. I would say I have a ton more questions I can ask you, but it's already getting close to 6 o'clock. So I may just take those offline or schedule another session with you. But I want to thank you for not only taking the time to give us a really good account of medicalization and how politics can use public health for nefarious reasons. And I want to thank the attendees who came, as well as the Center for Ethics, the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, and the School of Medicine for putting this program together. So Amanda, thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you. I really appreciate being here tonight.